oh gosh, and a very computerized voice telling us that we're being recorded. So anyway, welcome to you all. It's good to see you all again. I recognize many names up on my screen, which is fantastic. So, I mean, I know we have people joining us from around the world as usual. So welcome to, where I am, a relatively subtropical Yorkshire today. So hopefully it's nice wherever you are at present. While we wait for people to join, I'd just like to say again, thank you for joining us at the Society for Church Archaeology. We put on these free lectures every month, and we have a range of exciting, thrilling speakers. So you're always welcome to come along. The lectures are, of course, free for everyone. But, and there is always a but, we would love you to join the Society for Church Archaeology, because it's not just these lectures we do. We obviously publish our journal, arrange conferences and all sorts of other things. In fact, I suspect if I don't say it, Rob is going to prompt me to remind you about the Society for Church Archaeology research grants, which are currently open. So if you have research project you might want some money for, join the society, and there's an opportunity there. So I think we've got people still joining, Rob, or are we pretty much?
We're good to go.
We are good to go. So people can join in as I speak. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Claire Kennan, who will be known to many of you because she's quite prolific in sort of the media and in academic circles too. She's a medieval historian, sort of specializing in the late Middle Ages, so sort of 1300 to 1500. And she did a PhD at Royal Holloway University, which I suspect is going to feed a little into our talk, and looking at guilds and society in Louth, which if you haven't been to Louth, I do advise go and visit Louth. Meridian Meats, best pork pies in Lincolnshire. Anyway, that was a free plug. I'm completely impromptu. Anyway, she's currently a lecturer at Queen's University, Canada, on their UK campus. And tonight we'll find out that she's a Bon Jovi fan as well, because she's going to be talking to us about living on a prayer, parish guilds in the Middle Ages. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully my PowerPoint has magically appeared. Yeah, smashing. I can see a thumbs up. That's great. Well, thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be delivering this lecture. And as Hugh just said, yes, there is a strong Bon Jovi reference in the title, Living on a Prayer, Parish Guilds in the Middle Ages. And to start with, I'm just going to open with a quote from a very famous document to us guild historians, and we'll be diving into these documents in a little bit more depth later on. So this document says, "The said brethren and sisters assemble every year in honour of the Blessed Mary at the Feast of Pentecost, each of them with a great candle in his hand at the procession. And they solemnly offer in the same church the said 7 waxes before the image of the Blessed Mary. And the said candles are kept to serve and burn in the said church around the bodies of each at the time of their death." Now, the reason that I've chosen this extract is because it really quite neatly summarises 2 of the main activities which were endorsed by late medieval parish guilds. That is the worship of saints through prayers and offering candles, and also the provision of burials. Now, quite often when we mention parish guilds, we conjure up images of societies that are perhaps secretive, subversive, or perhaps even carrying out illicit or illegal actions. From the very first formal inquiry into the business of guilds in 1179 to 80, right through to their portrayal in the modern world. So, for example, in films such as The Da Vinci Code, and you can see some images from that on screen now, these societies have been fetishized and portrayed as insurrectionary and seditious. But tonight I'd like to ask, what were the guilds of the Middle Ages? What was their role in medieval society? Who could belong to them? And to quote the famous Bon Jovi classic, were they simply living on a prayer? I'm going to start with a bit of a definition for anyone who is unfamiliar with medieval guilds. So the way that historians define them in the Middle Ages is these groups of men and women who came together voluntarily under the patronage of either a particular saint or a holy symbol. And they did this in order to support traditional religious ceremonies. They're really seen as an incredibly important vehicle for the expression of late medieval lay piety, and they are a popular organisation that we see across medieval Europe. And they really are a fascinating area of study because they can highlight aspects of lay piety and religion at a very local level, along with raising questions about individual and community identities. And they provide us with this insight into the priorities and beliefs of ordinary men and women from the mid to late 14th century, right through until their dissolution in the mid 16th century. Now, as I've alluded to with the quote from the source at the beginning of my talk, the central purpose of all of these guilds and fraternities was indeed to provide their members with a proper burial and to perform masses for the souls of the deceased. So in this respect, they were very much living on a prayer. However, they did lots of other really interesting things too. So they held regular meetings, they staged annual feasts to honour their patron saint, and their activities and responsibilities extended much further into the lives of their communities. So for example, we see them carrying out repairs to parish churches, and in some cases actually rebuilding entire portions of parish churches. They also provided charity for destitute members. And their activities within the wider community could benefit the local economy, for example, with the demand for additional food and drink on feast days, often profiting the local victualling trades. Many guilds and fraternities also played an active role in the political and social life of their communities. For example, we see them regulating the behaviour of their members. Often this was divided along gender lines, so men would be, admonished for gambling or wandering about late at night, and women in particular were often warned not to hang around with men who were not their husbands. But they also had very close associations with the local ruling elite of particular towns as well. Now, the term fraternity comes from the Latin word fraternitas, but it's actually used interchangeably with guild, brotherhood, and society in contemporary documents. What's interesting is that historians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries tried to define guilds and fraternities as separate entities. So they often assumed that all guilds were craft or trade associations, and that fraternities only served social or religious purposes. Now, craft regulation was undoubtedly a feature of some later urban guilds, and we see this particularly in areas such as London, Lincoln, and York. But the majority of medieval guilds remain primarily parish-based institutions with a religious focus at their core, and they bring people together irrespective of their craft, trade, or profession. And it's also really common for individuals to join more than one guild or fraternity to extend their potential contacts and allow for greater social, economic, and political opportunities. It's really important to remember that these organisations had no legal characterisation, and they're very fluid in character, but religion was always a key part of the corporate life of all types of guilds. The historian Derek Keane has noted how parish guilds could effectively act as shell organisations, and they had this great flexibility in the variety of different forms that they could take, and this allowed them to support the parish in whatever way was needed. So within a single guild, therefore, a group of individuals could pursue a variety of different aims, all of which was often done informally. And in many ways, the flexibility of parish guilds reflects the flexibility of the churches in which they were based, both being used for secular and sacred means, and both working together within a shared framework. The members of parish guilds were bound together by shared ties of loyalty, and they were really cohesive and distinctive groups, working together within a structure of mutual obligation, which was reinforced by the taking of oaths. And this was usually done upon entry and then reaffirmed every year at the annual feast. And so in this way, we see the formation of a very strong communal identity within these voluntary and socially homogenous groups. Guilds and fraternities were headed by an alderman, who was usually assisted by a steward and a dean, and possibly also a clerk, who were all chosen to govern and oversee the group. Now, these men were not chosen sort of in the modern democratic sense that we would think of electing officials. They were chosen from a pre-decided group who were usually already the leading men within that guild and within the wider community. So although fraternities and guilds clearly encouraged horizontal ties of loyalty between their members, particularly through the oath-taking, their structure still conformed to the hierarchical organisation of wider medieval society, with officers and wardens who had to be obeyed. While women could be members of these associations, generally speaking, they could not hold office. There are some cases of single-sex guilds. They're particularly prevalent in the West Country. We see a lot of them, for example, down in Devon. And in those situations, women could hold office, but generally speaking, in a mixed-sex guild, it was men who could only hold the offices. Many wealthier guilds also went on to own their own guild hall, and on screen you can see the Coventry Guild Hall now, which is a very famous example of this. And these buildings were really places where the guilds would hold their meetings, their feasts, and their elections. And as we progress through the Middle Ages, they become really important shared community spaces. By about 1500, it's estimated that there were some 30,000 parish guilds in existence across the country. And if we consider that by this point, parish boundaries have been firmly established and we've got some 9,000 parish churches, we can say with some relative degree of confidence that in every parish there would have been at least one, if not many more, of these associations. But what was it about the later Middle Ages that encouraged such a proliferation of guilds and fraternities? Well, the first thing to consider is, of course, the doctrine of purgatory, which had taken several centuries to be developed and refined by the church. Now, although we know that purgatory was seen as significantly better than hell, the laity obviously wished to minimise the amount of time that they would potentially spend there. And on screen for you now, I've got this lovely quote by Eamon Duffy, which quite graphically describes the types of things that you might endure in purgatory, and a beautiful image of a hellmouth as well to really drive that message home. So the main way that people could shorten the time they would potentially spend in purgatory was by securing masses for their soul. And this sort of corporate intercession was a central part of late medieval religion. Now, in this way, parish guilds allowed for the democratization of this system of pious endowments. In the earlier Middle Ages, it was the nobility and the gentry who had the resources to offer endowments in exchange for monastic prayers for the benefit of their souls. But even in the late 14th century, it has been estimated by Judith Middleton Stewart that the scale of endowment needed to establish a perpetual chantry would have been at least £200, possibly considerably more. Now, this is obviously a very large sum of money, which most of the population would not have had access to. And I should note that the endowment for a perpetual chantry doesn't necessarily need to be in cold hard cash. It could also be a property, a piece of land, or a collection of manors. But again, this is something that the ordinary people of the Middle Ages just wouldn't have been able to do. And it was through the rents accrued from these lands and properties that a parish would be able to pay for an additional priest who could then provide these masses. So in their most basic form then, most late medieval parish guilds and fraternities were communal chantries, and they employed a priest or a chaplain to perform masses on behalf of all of their members, both living and dead. And the emergence of parish guilds and fraternities, particularly in the second half of the 14th century, allowed for ordinary men and women to act collaboratively to provide for endowments for the benefit of all their souls, much in the way that the nobility had been able to do in previous centuries. Along with this development of the doctrine of purgatory, we also need to take into consideration the socio-economic events of the 14th century, which also directly contributed to the proliferation of medieval parish guilds. Of course, we have the famines of the early 14th century, the arrival of the Black Death in 1348 and its subsequent visitations, continuing warfare with France and the Great Revolt of 1381, all of which have really contributed to this narrative that the 14th century was one of disaster and catastrophe. Now, undoubtedly, all of this would have played a part in the development of parish guilds, and in particular, this increased fear of an unexpected death without a proper burial. And this clearly accelerated the foundation of and membership to parish guilds across the country. And often historians see the arrival of the Black Death and the unceremonial burial practices associated with it as a clear break in the history of guilds and fraternities. But it's very important to note that these guilds were in existence prior to the Black Death, and they are not a direct result of the pandemic. Instead, it's this greater social mobility and increased wealth per capita, which allows a greater number of people the financial freedom to join their local guild than ever before. And of course, in an age of plague, a guaranteed burial with all the relevant intercessory masses for your soul had a clear and undeniable appeal. Now, in order to consider what it was that medieval guilds were actually doing, I'd like to have a look at a particular case study, which is the Guild Inquiry of 1389. So what happens is, late in 1388, Richard II's government orders a nationwide survey into the activities and finances of the country's guilds. And you can see the writ that was sent out to every county relating to this, asking for all the masters and wardens to send back information about their oaths, their meetings, their liberties, privileges, statutes and customs, and as well as details relating to any lands and monies that they held. The returns for this inquiry were made in early 1389 from across the country. What's interesting here is that the reason for this inquiry is never explicitly stated, but there are a number of factors at play. Firstly, in the years immediately after the Great Revolt of 1381, those in power were obviously unnerved by the idea of ordinary people organising themselves into seemingly secretive groups and taking those oaths of loyalty that seem to go against the hierarchical nature of medieval society. Secondly, Richard II is also starting to run out of money as a result of his various disastrous wars and foreign policies. And he possibly sees the guilds as the cash cow that he needs to get out of his financial troubles. So he orders this nationwide inquiry, and generally the guilds do partake in this exercise. Now, 1389 is a really important moment in parish guild history, and the documents that survive are of exceptional value because they come from a time when these groups of men and women are formalizing their identities, usually for the first time in these organizations. And the inquiry also represents the first time that the government and the ruling elite take an active interest in the undertakings of these associations en masse. Without these documents, we would be almost entirely ignorant of guild and fraternity activity before the 15th century. With the exception of a small clutch of Anglo-Saxon records, the 1389 inquiry constitutes the first substantial body of evidence we have for the existence of parish guilds in England. Just over 500 returns from the inquiry survive at the National Archives in London. However, as I've mentioned, if we consider that there were about 9,000 parishes across England at this time, this number seems incredibly small, particularly if we consider that most parish churches had more than one guild attached to it at any one time. The geographical distribution of the evidence from the 1389 inquiry is also very uneven. The county yielding the highest number of guild returns is Norfolk with 165, followed by Lincolnshire with 124, Cambridgeshire with 60, London with 42, and Suffolk with 39. Some counties, such as Bedfordshire, Berkshire, Lancashire, and Wiltshire, are represented only by a single return for the whole county, and other counties are just not represented at all. We know that there are at least 140 guilds in existence in Cornwall in the later Middle Ages, but no returns survive at all for the county in 1389. This obviously leads us to ask, why there is such a disparity in the pattern of the returns, particularly bearing in mind that this government writ was issued to the whole of England. Some explanations that have been put forward include the fact that particular areas of the country may have just ignored the writ and never completed the returns, but in my opinion, this seems quite unlikely. I believe that it's much more probable, given the damaged state of some of the documents that are at the National Archives, that the evidence for some areas has simply been destroyed or lost in the intervening centuries. All of the returns that do survive are written on varying shapes and sizes of parchment, which possibly reflects the economic status of the guilds in terms of what they could afford to purchase for the purposes of the inquiry. The majority of the returns are on single loose leaf sheets of parchment. A few are bound along the top in the exchequer style, and some have been made into small books of a single quire containing between 6 and 8 folios. Some of the documents appear to have even had seals attached to them at one time, possibly indicating that they came from one of the wealthier and more politically influential guilds. The content of these returns also varies significantly, and sometimes we can see patterns with this relating to different regions, but at other times it is seemingly random. Many returns, like the one you can see on screen now, are very lengthy, and they contain all of the fraternity's ordinances, while others are literally a couple of lines. But given the nature of this inquiry and Richard II's perceived motives for it, perhaps these silences and gaps can really sort of indicate to us some of the concerns that the guilds may have had in revealing too much information. Yet, despite all these glaring gaps in the evidence that I have just pointed out, these documents are really, really useful to us, and they can give us an indication of guild activity from across the country. And to highlight how this played out at a local level, I'd like to draw specifically on a case study within this body of evidence, which draws on my doctoral research, looking at the market town of Louth in the Lincolnshire Wolds. And as Hugh said at the beginning, if you've not visited it yet, you really should. It is stunning. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with where Louth is, I have got a little map up on screen for you now, so you can sort of work out whereabouts in the country we are. Now, the reason that I've chosen to focus on Louth as a case study is that there's a surprising amount of surviving evidence for the guilds there from the late 14th century right through until their dissolution in the mid-16th century. And this means that we're able to trace the development of the town's guilds from the very first government intervention in 1389 until its last intervention in the mid-16th century. At the time of the 1389 inquiry, 5 parish guilds are recorded in Louth, and these are the guilds of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Holy Trinity, St Swithin, Corpus Christi, and the 12 Apostles, all of which were based in the town's only church, St James's, which is also on screen for you now. In the later Middle Ages, Louth was a market town with a population of between 600 and 700 people who were engaged in a number of crafts and trades, the most prominent of which was the wool and cloth industry. Louth was one of Lincolnshire's 8 major population centres, and it became known as the capital of the Wolds during the 14th century, with its economy flourishing well into the 15th and early 16th centuries as a result of its location. The town is situated between 2 distinct geographical areas, the Wolds, which was a wool-growing country, and the marshlands, which was sheep-grazing country. And this provided the town with the location it needed to dominate the local area. Now, Louth is perhaps most famous for 2 reasons. Firstly, it is home to the tallest medieval parish church spire in England, which was largely built through funding generated by the town's guilds. And secondly, it was also the starting place for the Lincolnshire Rising in 1536, which acted as the catalyst for the very famous Pilgrimage of Grace, a very significant rebellion against Henry VIII and his early religious reforms. Until the mid-16th century, Louth came under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Lincoln, who was the town's lord. Louth was a manor and not an incorporated borough of the Bishop of Lincoln. And this means that while it had a manorial court, some of which the court rolls do actually survive, the town has no formal institutions of self-government. What we see across England in the later Middle Ages is that in several of our country's seigneurial towns, merchant or religious guilds functioned as a means of local government, so that the inhabitants of these towns could exert some authority and control over their own affairs. In the words of S.H. Rigby, these associations functioned as a club or shadow government and were made up of the town's leading men. And what is really clear is that in these towns where ecclesiastical lordship persisted into the 15th and 16th centuries, we find parish guilds extending beyond their original purpose of living on a prayer into the everyday running and management of the town. So taking Louth as our case study from the 1389 inquiry, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into what these guilds were up to. And the first thing I'd like to consider is the guild choice of dedication. So the choice of dedication was really important to founding members, and it reveals those saints to which communities felt an especial attachment. Now, across England, we see that the cult of the Blessed Virgin Mary has the most dedications, which is probably unsurprising. She receives 127 dedications in the surviving evidence, followed by the Holy Trinity with 55 and then Corpus Christi with 44. And all three of these dedications were present in Louth at the end of the 14th century. So it's largely following national trends. Alongside these nationally popular saints cults, we also see parish guilds which were dedicated to more recent and emerging cults, such as that of St. George, and also more locally specific saints, such as St. Guthlac. Now, parish guilds adopted a saint or a holy object at their foundation on the assumption that in return for their devotion, they would be protected and assisted by the saint during life and after death. One of the newer saints cults which was significantly represented in Lincolnshire in the 1389 inquiry and also at Louth was that of Corpus Christi. Now, according to the surviving returns, as I've said, 44 guilds nationally were dedicated to Corpus Christi across England, and 18 of these came from Lincolnshire. What we notice when we look at the foundation dates for these particular guilds is that there is a clustering of foundations occurring during the plague years of 1341 to 60. But even more interesting is that the Corpus Christi Guild at Louth is known to have been founded much earlier, back in 1326, and the guild refers to this date in its 1389 return. This foundation date points to the very early growth of the cult in England, and more specifically in Lincolnshire. Even when compared with later estimates, the number of Corpus Christi Guild dedications in Lincolnshire remains relatively high. Ken Farnhill has looked at guild dedications during the period of 1470 to 1550 from the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, Yorkshire, Cornwall, London, and Cambridgeshire. But even during this later period, dedications to Corpus Christi remain relatively low, usually only represented by between 1% and 4% of a county's overall guild dedications. The real exception here is Cambridgeshire, which has 13.42% of its guild dedications made to Corpus Christi in this period. But even in the preceding century, Lincolnshire's Corpus Christi guilds represent an estimated 14.5% of the county's known guild dedications. So we really see it emerging as a dominant dedication this early on in 1389, and particularly with that really early guild foundation in 1326 in Louth. So we seem to have this localized concentration of the cult. And this really points to a lot of cross-continental mixing and influences, particularly with Northwestern Europe through Louth's mercantile population, which I will come back to later. Now, an integral part in the cult of venerating the saints was represented by maintaining a light in the guild chapel, often before the image of the guild's patron. 70% of the 500 plus guild returns made in 1389 mentioned the maintenance of a light as one of their main activities. And in all 5 of the surviving returns for Louth, this activity is specifically mentioned. The Guild of St. Swithin has a single candle, which is lit each year, presumably on the Guild's annual feast day. The Guild of Corpus Christi and the Guild of the 12 Apostles each light their candles. The Corpus Christi Guild has 6, 12 Apostles has 12, as part of their annual processions through the town. The Guild of the Blessed Virgin Mary has 7 candles which are lit daily at the Guild Mass, and a further 7 along with a great candle, which were used during the Guild's procession at Pentecost and at various funerals. The Holy Trinity Guild has 3 candles which burn every Sunday and on all double feast days, and then a further 40 candles which are used at the funerals of their members. So maintaining a candle in honour of the patron saint was a relatively low-cost, unobtrusive act of devotion, and clearly England's guilds felt safe about disclosing this information to Chancery during the 1389 inquiry. Along with devoting themselves to the patron saint through various prayers and the lighting of candles, the other central reason for founding a parish guild, as I've mentioned, was to offer an accessible means by which ordinary people could ensure the safety of their souls following death. And this was immediately achieved through the provision of funerals and intercessory masses, but it was also furthered by participation in other activities such as patronal feast celebrations, processions, and charitable works. To bury the dead was one of the 7 corporal acts of mercy which the guilds really excelled in. The annual membership fees paid by guild members during their lifetimes ensured that their soul would be supported in death. Now, the details of funeral provisions vary greatly in the surviving guild returns, and interestingly, Louth's guilds do remain largely silent on this front. The only mention of funeral provision that we get in the Louth Guild returns comes from the 2 larger guilds of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Holy Trinity, where both guilds state that they will indeed provide candles for a member's funeral. However, if we look slightly further afield to Lincolnshire at large, particularly to the Guild of Corpus Christi at St Michael on the Hill in Lincoln itself, we get a lot more detail about what these guild burials would have included. So the Guild of Corpus Christi at St Michael at Hill in Lincoln states that they had a guild banner which was publicly displayed at the house of the deceased guild member and then borne ahead of the corpse with the great candle in the procession to the church. At the church itself, the body was placed upon a hearse and 4 soul candles were set around it. Then at the funeral, the aldermen and serving officers of the guild would each give a penny to the mass. Other guild members were expected to attend and to make an offering of half a penny in soul alms. Another central activity that we see for the guilds is this provision of additional masses and prayers for their members, sometimes even employing their own chaplain to do so. In 1389, only 21% of guilds reported that they employed 1 or occasionally more chaplains. It's really important to remember that guild chaplains are not employed to be in competition in any way with the parish priest. They're actually offering additional services that the parish priest often does not have the capacity to deliver. And this includes officiating the guild's Saints' Day celebrations and performing any additional masses that are required. On average, the cost of employing a guild chaplain in the 15th century was 8 marks a year, or if food and board were included, it was 4 marks. And this makes the employment of a regular guild chaplain a really expensive undertaking, and obviously not all guilds can contemplate this. However, we know that both the Holy Trinity and Blessed Virgin Mary guilds at Louth did employ guild chaplains as early as 1389. We know that the chaplain for the Blessed Virgin Mary Guild performed masses for the souls of deceased members and regular services every evening at dusk. And the Holy Trinity chaplain likewise celebrated mass for the souls of the guild's founders and of all of its departed members. The employment of a chaplain was really an important factor in establishing a guild's collective identity. It's at the guild's mass that the guild's identity really receives its most profound and complete expression. It's the moment when both living and dead members receive equal attention for the benefit of their souls in purgatory. Now, often guilds would rent out land or properties that they had been bequeathed in order to fund their chaplain. And again, we see evidence of this in the Louth Guild returns. But this was a contentious issue in the eyes of royal authorities. In theory, only those guilds who'd been granted mortmain licenses were allowed to rent out land and property in this way. And very few guilds actually nationally mention these licenses. But the Blessed Virgin Mary Guild at Louth does, and it actually goes into quite a lot of detail about how much land and property it is allowed to have. Now, considering the possible financial motives that Richard II may have had for this inquiry, many returns omit any reference to the performance of any type of additional mass or the employment of a chaplain, because this would indicate a surplus income. Interestingly as well, many guilds even go as far as to add a clause at the end of their return that they didn't own any goods, any possessions, lands or tenements. But we know if we cross-reference this with surviving guild account books that this isn't always the case, and that quite often they are employing these guild chaplains and they are paying for them through the income that's generated through renting property and land. And we can see this as a regular expenditure for the guilds in Louth. Mention of feasting and drinking, which were really defining activities for the guilds, is also strikingly absent from the 1389 returns. Only 12% of guilds refer to this activity in their documents, and none of Louth guilds actually specifically cite feasting or drinking. What's really interesting with guild feasts is that while they're used to promote love and charity among their members, there's often lots of rules and regulations that accompany this. And this highlights to us that these were occasions for social interactions which could lead to conflict and even disorderly behaviour. Quite often there are very strict rules about when the prayers will be said. Sometimes this can be at the opening of each barrel of wine. Sometimes it's at the serving of the different courses of the meals. But what's really important with a guild feast is that it has this formal function of maintaining the structure and hierarchy of the association, because this is the point at which often the aldermen and the other officials are elected, and also you have the accounts and the rules and regulations read aloud to remind every member of what they should be doing. The return for the Blessed Virgin Mary Guild in Louth does suggest that there's an annual feast celebration, and this is the point at which the alderman, dean and four stewards are chosen to uphold the guild's ordinances, look after the candles and the collection of alms, and to dispose of the stipend for the chaplain, but it's not explicit. Processions, plays and pageantry are activities with which guilds become more strongly associated in the later 15th and early 16th centuries, particularly through the performance of play cycles. Now, while at the end of the 14th century there's very little mention of any pageantry on this grand scale, there does seem to be some pageantry on a much lesser scale taking place, particularly on patronal feast days. And this again is very important to guilds because this pattern of ceremonies and observances throughout the liturgical year really is at the heart of late medieval popular culture. And while it's clear that these events did promote cohesion within local communities, relatively few guilds in 1389 actually stated in their returns that they partook in any of these activities. Only 7% of guilds nationally mention that they have any form of procession at all. But the actual number is really likely to be much higher. Again, it's this idea of, if we show that we've got a lot of wealth and we're displaying that through plays and pageantry and pomp, then the government might come for it. In 3 out of the 5 surviving guild returns for Louth, there is a brief reference to some form of procession. So we know that the guilds of the 12 Apostles and Corpus Christi hold a procession at the Feast of Corpus Christi, and then the Guild of the Blessed Virgin Mary holds a procession at Pentecost. But again, if we look slightly further afield to Lincolnshire more widely, we can see that other forms of pageantry, plays and processions were commonplace. For example, Holbeach in Lincolnshire actually has the machinery necessary to put on a full Assumption play, and there are records which talk of men carrying the Mary cart and using puppets. And this indicates that because the town doesn't have live-in actors, they're using these puppets instead for the action, which seems to be quite common. In 1480, the Holy Trinity Guild in Sleaford puts on a play about the Ascension of Christ. And then in the 1540s, over in Spalding in Lincolnshire, there is a play which seems to have been about a war in heaven. It's not too clear in the documents what that is. But if a parish couldn't stretch to have these pageants with plays and processions, they do perform much simpler processions, often to the parish church with flowers, candles, and sometimes even a bit of dancing. So on Easter morning, we know that all of the Boston guilds in Lincolnshire participated in the liturgy and the procession for the resurrection. The guilds went and adorned their individual guild altars in the church and then processed through the chancel in their liveries. The Guild of St. John the Baptist in Baston required specifically that all of the sisters of the guild, not the brothers, just the sisters, dance together during their Saints' Day procession to the parish church. And in Stamford, the Guild of St Martin appears to have held some form of bull baiting on their feast day, where the bull was hunted before the procession and then sold afterwards. Now, many of the Guild activities cited in their 1389 returns would have constituted charitable acts, and so they were therefore beneficial more broadly to individual members, particularly in relation to getting their souls through purgatory as quickly as possible, particularly as through acts of charity you were ensuring the prayers of those who had been helped. But charitable acts performed by guilds were more often than not largely introspective. Guilds usually operated on a principle of self-help and help for their own members, and the provision of schools, charity and masses were usually only available for their own members and benefactors. Now, in the Louth Guild returns from 1389, aside from the provision of funerals, the only additional mention of any charitable work comes in the return from the Holy Trinity Guild, which does say that in addition to performing a funeral at these occasions, every member was to give a further quarterpenny to the soul arms. But if we look further afield again, we can see that some fraternities are also providing help to any of their members who fall on hard times. So in Lincoln, we see particularly provision is made for members who die without, outside the parish, and they're brought back to the parish and buried at the expense of the guild. Provision is also made for members who wish to go on pilgrimage but can't afford to do so. In his research into guild charity, Ben McCree links the guilds providing charitable relief with those based in urban environments, who were often the most prominent within their local communities. And we see this pattern emerging, that the guilds who are engaging in public processions, in burials and masses, and also those who had special rules which governed members' behaviour, were more likely to have a clear charitable component, probably because they were more visible in their community. McCree has found that overall, 55% of urban guilds in 1389 promised some form of charitable aid, while only 15% from rural communities did so. Approximately half of the guilds which in the 1389 inquiry pledged this type of charitable aid also often claimed that they had an income from rented property, and this tends to average out at about £9 a year. It's really important to remember, though, with these documents, that the activities that were accorded prominence in the returns were really done so in order to make these associations appear as conservative as possible. But this doesn't mean, however, that guild activities were limited to religious observance only, nor does it mean that individuals' motivations for joining a guild were completely religious in focus. Although the founding members of a fraternity undoubtedly joined for religious reasons, the motives for other members joining later may have been more mixed. New members may well have joined for pious reasons, but some may have also joined in order to follow the example of older family members. Some have been motivated to join the guild's occasions of conviviality, or even to gain access to the important men in the town with whom business might be done, including lending or borrowing money, or local disputes resolved. It's also important to remember that to contemporaries, religious observance and sociability were not two distinct activities. To the men and women of the later Middle Ages, these activities happened in a seamless continuum. Guilds can therefore be clearly characterised as combining pious activities with various social, economic and political aims, and they encouraged a continual oscillation between the spiritual development of individual members and the wider aims of the group. Now, it's actually in the later guild documents that we can learn more about these wider, more secular roles that the guilds took on in their communities. And while the guild returns offer an insight into guild activity for this one specific year in 1389, we do need to turn to other evidence to examine what was going on in the 15th and early 16th century. And often we're afforded this through the survival of guild accounts, church warden accounts, and wills, as well as the documents of the guild's dissolution. And this really allows us to build a full, if intermittent, picture of the history of parish guilds in the later Middle Ages. And it's to some of these documents that I'd like to turn next. Now, in many late medieval towns, a single guild could become dominant, with its institutions overlapping with those of the town and wider parish. And examples of this can be seen across the country. In Norwich, the Guild of St George provided the local government with financial assistance, helped to elect city officials, and contributed to public ceremonies. In Abingdon, the Fraternity of the Holy Cross was the instrument through which civic authority was exercised in petitioning the government to grant the town with a 3-day fair. The fraternity was also responsible for maintaining the town's bridges. Cases where guilds served as these shadow governments were usually found in the towns where inhabitants only had limited autonomy. In lacking the freedom to direct their own local affairs, the town's inhabitants turned to the guilds and used their corporate apparatus to gain some measure of self-governance. And it appears that this is the case for Louth during the 15th and early 16th century, because as I've mentioned, the town came under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Lincoln until 1549. And this means that Louth doesn't enjoy the independence of a borough town. And what we see here is that two guilds in particular, the Holy Trinity and Blessed Virgin Mary guilds, were used by local elites as a means of exerting their power in the community. And in particular, this appears to have been the case for Louth's mercantile population. And this is revealed in some of the guild's own documents, including its surviving account books, which you can see an image of on screen for you now. Now, when we examine this evidence, it becomes clear that the majority of the town's merchants were also leading men in the community in other capacities. By the early 15th century, both of Louth's major guilds already had a number of officers in well-established roles, including those of alderman, steward, clerk, and dean, as I have mentioned. The power of the alderman and other officers is not purely symbolic, and it's based on the long-established principles of the authority of the assembly of people and its chosen leader. And the organisational structure of late medieval guilds and their ceremonial activities developed to reflect this structure. Virginia Bainbridge has found that in Cambridgeshire, guilds often reflected the hierarchies of their own communities, meaning that those men with the highest office in the guild also had the highest office without. And this really allowed them to bring their own personal authority to the association, and their power and status was confirmed by their external authority in the wider community. An analysis of Louth's guild officers shows that just over a third of the men who served as alderman or dean were indeed merchants. And a clear example of this mercantile dominance can be seen in 1497, when the Holy Trinity Guild account actually lists the members who witnessed the closing of the accounts for that year. Out of a total of 14 named members, 6 were merchants, and these men appear to have been really prominent both in the wider town and parish and in the guild itself. 3 of these men, Thomas Messenger, William Butler, and Richard Lindsay, who were all merchants, are also each given a key which opens the guild chest, which contains the account and the guild's monies. And this really gives them a position of authority within and without the guild. Now, the strong mercantile membership of Louth's guilds really allows them to act as an unofficial town council, with the benefit to them as members in particular and their wider interests. We also see similar positions elsewhere. For example, if we look at nearby Boston in Lincolnshire, where local merchants really favour the parish guilds which have the most influence in the town. And interestingly, it's also these guilds which carry out the most charitable work by building almshouses, supporting the poor, and providing education, along with engaging in municipal activities such as maintaining sewers, riverbanks, sea dikes, and bridges. Guild officers wielded considerable influence in Boston at a time when it was not self-governing, and we see this reflected in what's happening in Louth as well in the 15th and early 16th centuries. So, for example, in Louth, the Holy Trinity Guild owned and managed the town's grammar school, where Louth's young men were educated until 1548, and this school was actually later refounded by Edward VI and still stands today. The Guild also owned and maintained an almshouse, which I had on screen a moment ago when I was talking about Guild charity. These were rebuilt in the 18th century, but they are standing on the original site. The Guild also maintained the roads and the sewers in the town. The Blessed Virgin Mary Guild then ran a song school for elementary education. It ran a guild hall, a second almshouse, and it funded the choir at St James's Church. The aldermen and guild officers in both of these leading guilds held positions of responsibility in the town, most commonly either as a grave, which was the main manorial official, more commonly known as a reeve elsewhere, or as one of the town's jurors. So these men already had considerable influence in the community and would have been well known to guild members and non-members alike. We also see a significant crossover between office holders of the guilds and the church wardens for St James's Church. And again, this is not uncommon. The position of church warden has long been viewed as a route into other local political offices. And in Louth, what we see is that often these men would hold manorial office first, either as a grave or a juror, and then they would proceed on to hold a guild or parochial office, which gives us a clear cursus honorum in the town. The church wardens of Louth were responsible, as they were elsewhere, for collecting rents, paying for repairs to the church, keeping the accounts, and acting as custodians for the church's goods. Importantly as well in Louth, they were heavily involved in funding the rebuilding of the church's spectacular spire, which was completed in 1515. Earlier scholarship on mercantile office holding and church wardens really sort of assumes that these positions were usually taken by the landed gentry and those really wealthy merchants. And while some historians, including Catherine French, have called this assumption into question, the evidence in Louth does seem to suggest that in fact this was the case. And this is further supported by work done by Beat Cumin, who has looked at 10 English parishes and found that the majority of church wardens did indeed come from the mercantile classes. The men who served in these offices at Louth had already developed the necessary skills for administering the parish's goods and property, either through managing their own lands and business activities or through holding one of the manorial offices. And this really allowed them to gain visibility and community trust before they went on to hold the important role of church warden and or guild alderman. In Louth, as at other towns across the country, repeat office holding is also not unusual. And we see the same groups of men serving in these offices together. So in Louth, just as in parishes up and down the country, we've got these same individuals and families appearing again and again as office holders, essentially forming an oligarchic elite within the town and parish, giving them the power that they needed in the locality to make the changes they wanted to, or to uphold the status quo. So I'm very aware of time, and I'm just going to hopefully briefly wrap up before we open up to questions. So I hope that what I've shown this evening is that while, yes, the core purpose of all guilds and fraternities in the Middle Ages was to protect the souls of their members through prayers and proper burials, they did engage in a whole host of activities which were beneficial to the wider community. From repairing roads, bridges and sewers to opening schools and almshouses, parish guilds were integral to the fabric of everyday life. These associations offered ordinary men and women a chance to socialise, make connections, and in some cases, climb the greasy pole of local politics. But at their core, they were, and remain to be, as Bon Jovi have famously sang, living on a prayer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much as well, Claire. I was desperately trying to think of another Bon Jovi pun to throw back at you, but I'm afraid I'm a bit rusty from the 80s. Anyway, that was a really fascinating talk. I should have said at the very beginning, and I know Rob has reminded people, but if you have a question for Claire, can you just pop it in the chat box and then Rob will field them. But I thought that was a really fascinating talk on what I think is an often overlooked aspect of parish life. We tend to focus on other structures there, so that was really illuminating. And and as the third plug for visit Louth, it really is a recommended place to go.
It's stunning. It's got such a beautiful
church. It is genuinely
really
stunning.
Yeah.
So fantastic. So Rob, do we have any questions yet?
Well, the first question is going to be from myself, if that's all right. And then we do have some more questions, yes. But the first question I had is, I've sort of been interested in the guilds in medieval York before, and I was just wondering if there's anything in guild accounts or wills to suggest parish guilds interacting in any way? Do they get on amicably with each other? Work collaboratively in any way?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of the combined guild of St George and St Christopher and things like that, and that relationship there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of evidence for guilds working really proactively together. And I mean, I'm sorry to keep harping on about Louth, that is my particular sort of area of interest. But what we see there is that actually the two larger guilds, so the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Holy Trinity Guild, basically sort of split the running of the town and its amenities in half, so that they can manage things effectively. So, you know, one looks after the guild hall, the other sort of takes responsibility for the schooling, and they work together really well. And there's a lot of movement of guild officers, so aldermans and deans, across both guilds. So they're really well connected, they're really working together. And often the membership as well is sort of shared. So you see lots of people belonging to both those guilds, and sometimes the smaller guilds too. And they work very closely with the church wardens, particularly in relation to fundraising for things like, you know, repairing the roof of the church or maintaining the sewer and all those kinds of things, but also for the much bigger things that they need to do. So in Louth, it is building this fantastic church spire, which costs several £1,000s. And I would say that there's examples of this up and down the country. You do get cases where guilds are rivals, but I would say more often than not, they're actually working together because they've all got this sort of shared interest in enhancing the parish, enhancing liturgical provision, and making things work for their community. So absolutely, we see lots of that cooperation and working together, which is really interesting.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a lot of good questions now, which is brilliant. So we're going to get through as many of them as we can.
Yeah, sure.
One question here is, if people had a choice of guild within their parish church, do we know how they chose?
No, it would have been really subjective, but generally speaking, you would go with the saint that you felt covered the most bases, which is why the Blessed Virgin Mary is so popular. She's a good bet. If you can only afford to join one guild, you're going to go for the guild that's going to offer you sort of the best bang for your buck, and that often is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Also as well, some people felt particular attachments to different saints, so we often see localized cults really emerging and being quite popular. As I mentioned, in Lincolnshire, Corpus Christi is really popular early on, and I think that's a lot to do with mercantile influences and trading, particularly with the Low Countries and Northwest Europe. But yeah, generally speaking, you're going to go with a saint that's going to offer you the best protection, and that's usually the good old BVM, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. No, that's good. Another question here is, do records survive detailing the wider membership of Louth guilds? And if so, what can we tell about its makeup in terms of status and geography?
So they don't have specific membership lists, but when we look at the accounts, we can see regular payments to office holders. So we have a very good idea of who's holding office. And also we can see who is being remembered in the guild masses. So although there's not a specific list, you can get a good picture. Generally speaking, at the top tier of the guilds, you've got a lot of merchants. You've also got sort of wealthier craftsmen, so people like goldsmiths, master masons. But a lot of crafts and trades are represented. So everyone from your carpenters and your shoemakers, you know, all the way through to the members of the gentry and members of the clergy as well. And women are members too. Usually they're sort of the wife of an existing member, but there are cases where single women join the guilds as well. We've got lots of interesting women joining Lincolnshire's guilds in the later Middle Ages. So it tends to be a case of piecing together the evidence and also looking really closely at the wills that survive and seeing if residents leave money to the guilds and which guilds they're leaving money to. That's another way we can cross-reference. But there's no specific membership lists for Louth, but there are for other guilds across the country, which are incredibly useful. So if they survive for your area, you're really lucky.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. One more. Could you please give a few examples of the kinds of relics kept by guilds? Were they displayed in specific ways for their audiences?
So in the guilds that I look at, they couldn't afford relics. They didn't really have any actual relics themselves, but the things that they treasured are listed in their inventories and in the inventories of the church wardens. So for example, we know that they have several books and texts that are very revered, particularly the text to their Corpus Christi play, and that's really safely guarded. They also, Louth actually had 4 beautiful silver crosses, one of which we believe was the cross that led the procession at the outbreak of the Lincolnshire Rising. So that's quite interesting. They've also got loads of sort of things that are gifted, you know, candlesticks, various vestments and fabrics. And they also, there's a really great, really great list in one of the accounts that provides all the stuff they have for their feasts, and it looks like an IKEA shopping list. It always makes me chuckle every time I see it, because it lists, you know, how many plates, how many chairs, and they have a folding table, which I think sounds very, you know, 21st century. But in terms of relics for the specific guilds that I've looked at, they don't have any because they're not quite of that status. However, other high status guilds from further afield would have been able to have sort of small relics and things, but unfortunately in Louth, they couldn't afford it.
Hugh, do we have time for a few more?
Oh, well, given we don't know, I mean, we've got more questions than we often get, so
yeah, fantastic.
Let's milk this bit.
Yeah, let's go. Right. Another question is, do we know anything about guilds organising group pilgrimages?
So in Lincolnshire, yes, because in 1389, what's quite unusual about the Lincoln returns is they specifically say they provide money and means for their members to go on pilgrimage. And there are specific points in the city as well that they wave the members off as they go off. And that's quite unusual because for that particular body of evidence, that's not mentioned elsewhere. And again, because not all of the returns survive, it could be happening more widely, but it's just, you know, what we've got surviving, it's showing up for Lincoln. Further afield later on, guilds certainly do that, but what's so interesting is that we get this sort of emerging quite early on in the 14th century. So yes, it is certainly something that guilds are interested in and that they're involved in, but the scale on which this is happening is quite difficult to discern. Although there's lots of evidence for parish guilds, it is sporadic. And again, this is why I've honed in on Louth, because actually there is a lot of evidence, so we can trace the development of these guilds. In other cases, as I was saying, you know, sometimes all you have is that one guild return or that one will that references them. But certainly based on the evidence we've got, they were organising pilgrimages. I don't think it would have been the entire guild going or anything like that. It probably would have been a small number of members who were seen off, particularly because obviously the guild would be funding it. It's quite an expensive undertaking.
Interesting, thank you very much. Got one more question here is, do we know much about women's activities in Louth? Were there any single-sex guilds? Not
in Louth there weren't, but there are loads in Devon. But the women are involved, and if you're interested, I have published a chapter on women's involvement in Lincolnshire's guilds, which is available on open access. So do Google that. But they are involved and they are active members, and they, you know, they're present at the feasts, they're present at all the services and the different sort of processions and things. They don't hold office though. That, you know, that is the one sort of thing that they do not do in Lincolnshire. Obviously in a single sex guild, that would have been possible, but not in a mixed sex guild. We do see them involved in some of the more sort of female jobs, you know, like cleaning the church before the feast and all of that good stuff. And there are some really interesting regulations around female behaviour in guilds as well, which I alluded to. So, you know, things like female members must not give in to the temptations of the flesh, or they will be expelled. Funnily enough, the same conditions aren't meted out to men. So we know that they're actively involved and they are present at all of these events because we've got these rules and regulations dictating their behaviour, which is interesting. But in terms of sort of leadership or anything higher up in Louth in particular, no. But you know, there are these women who appear in the accounts sort of throughout the entirety of the run. So I know Margaret White is a particular favourite of mine. She keeps popping up. She lives in a particularly dodgy tenement belonging to the guild, and in the end they decide to pay her rent for life. I think they're fed up of the door frame falling down, but you know, so she's a very vocal guild member and she's not afraid to complain, and we get lots of little interesting stories like that coming up as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Claire. I'll hand back to you now.
Well, fantastic. I think you're lining yourself up for another lecture on women and guilds, because I think that'd be an absolutely fantastic topic. And I know I've seen the comments that have come into the chat box. You've generated an awful lot of interest, so that's fantastic. So I'd like to thank you very much for the talk. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you, Claire. It just remains for me to just draw things to a close and remind you, if you're not aware, or remind you if you are aware, or let you know if you're not aware, that our next lecture on the 9th of December is going to be by James Wright, and he's going to be giving us an introduction to historical graffiti, which I think actually should be rather interesting, because it's definitely a burgeoning area of research, and I think we could all learn something from that. So do join us then in December. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank our speaker Claire again, and obviously thank you, Rob, for assisting, and I hope we will see you all again soon.
Thank you.